Hi, my name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you all out to today's event. The Institute, for those of you who are not aware, was established here at WSU back in 1995 to honor the service of Thomas S. Foley, who was a former Speaker of the House of Representatives and served the district here in the House of Representatives for nearly 30 years. And one of our core missions on campus is actually to foster and promote public service. And so it's really a distinct honor and privilege for us today to have this panel. I want to recognize President Floyd, who's in the audience here today. And then I will now introduce the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and he will in turn introduce our panelists today. So Doug Epperson, who's the Dean of Liberal Arts, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
All right, thank you. Is the mic necessary?
I think.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome you to the event today, which is WSU Women in Public Service. We're very proud as an institution to claim these women as our graduates, and I think you will understand why by the end of the afternoon. I want to thank all of you for coming. I know some of you had to really ride the wind to get here, so congratulations to you for being determined enough to get here as well. I want to introduce these four remarkable women today. I'm going to keep it pretty short because I know you came here to listen to them and not listen to me, and if I really hit all the highlights of their careers and all their accomplishments, we'd use up all the time with just the introductions. So in alphabetical order, let me begin with Joni Earl. Joni is a graduate of the College of Business. She also went on and earned an MBA from the University of Puget Sound and graduated from Harvard University State and Local Government Executive Program. She is currently the CEO of the Puget Transit System, and she's held that position since 2000. How many of you are from the Puget Sound? Okay, so you're all pretty familiar then with the Puget Transit System. It develops, coordinates, and manages the mass transit systems for the entire Puget Sound region. And under Joni's leadership, there have been a number of dramatic improvements in the Puget Sound mass transit system, including the development or implementation of the light rail systems, new transit centers, park and ride lots, and high occupancy vehicles access lanes, to name a few. Joni was recognized by Seattle Magazine as one of the 25 most influential people in the Puget Sound, and the Puget Sound Business Journal identified her as one of the 20 women of influence in the same region. Patricia McInturff is a WSU graduate from the College of Liberal Arts with a degree in sociology. She too has had a long career in public service, most of it spent in the public health sector and the human service sector. Now, I know most of you understand what goes on in public health. On the human services side, that department operates programs and services that meet the basic needs of children, teens, seniors, families, domestic violence victims, immigrants, refugees, persons with disabilities, basically anyone who's vulnerable in our society. The Department of Human Services is responsible for ensuring that their basic needs are met. Patricia retired in 2009 as the director of the Seattle Human Services Department, a position which she had held for 5 years. Prior to that, she was executive director of the Seattle and King County Senior Services Unit and director of the Prevention Division of the Department of Public Health. And in that latter position, Ms. McInturff led the city and county's public health response to HIV/AIDS. And this work resulted in her being recognized in 1994 with a Municipal League's Public Employee of the Year award. Sue Rahr is also a graduate from the College of Liberal Arts with a degree in criminal justice. She's had a remarkable career of over 30 years now in the King County Sheriff's Office. She rose through the ranks to the position of Chief of Operations, and eventually in 2005 she was appointed as Sheriff of King County. She currently holds that position. She's the first woman to be appointed as Sheriff of King County. Presumably will not be the last due to her pioneering efforts. As sheriff, she commands hundreds of officers, negotiates the more than $100 million budget for the King County Sheriff's Office. She handles the service contracts with the cities that contract with the County Sheriff's Department. and she effectively deals with the myriad of political and bureaucratic obstacles that she encounters on a daily basis in her work. Our moderator for today's panel is Connie Niva. That is a name that will be familiar to many of you because she's currently a member of the WSU Board of Regents, a position that she's held since 2003. Connie graduated from WSU with a degree in bacteriology. I think it's probably a degree we don't have anymore because the biological sciences changed so rapidly.
It's called microbiology.
Yes, it's changed microbiology, and in a couple more years it could have a different name. She worked for many years as a microbiologist, including positions at the other university in Washington and the University of Maryland, and did somewhat of a left turn or right turn in 1986 when she was elected to the Everett City Council. Since then, she served in a variety of public capacities, including 2 terms on the Washington State Transportation Commission. And also during that time, she found time to earn an MBA from Seattle University. As I mentioned, currently, Ms. Niva serves as a Board of Regent for Washington State University. She also is the current Port Commissioner for the Port of Everett, and she's a founding member of the board for the Center for Women and Democracy. Ms. Niva was awarded the Everett Area Chamber of Commerce's Henry M. Jackson Citizen of the Year Award in 2003 and the United Way Snohomish County Women Leading the Way Leadership Award in 2002. So with that, let me turn the panel over to you, Connie, and I know the audience is eager to hear from all 4 of you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, all of you. It's a real honor today to be here to moderate this rather distinguished panel of women leaders. I have to be particularly nice to the sheriff because I live in her jurisdiction. And as you can imagine, there are some benefits and some lack of benefits to that sort of situation. Thinking about this panel today, I looked up in Wikipedia what their comments on public service were, and I'm going to read you that just quickly. Public service is a term usually used to mean services provided by government to its citizens, either through the public sector or by financing private provision of services associated with a social consensus through democratic elections that certain services should be available to all, regardless of income. It's also a course, it's said, that could be studied at a university, so you all know that probably too. They went on to say something interesting I mentioned to my fellow panelists a few minutes ago. They said that essential service would be the provision of the right to water, and they suggested a non-essential service would be hairdressing. So you can decide whether you think that's an essential service or not. See, they all laugh. Anyway, so you all know the subject of that. First, I want to ask my panelists if there's anything you want to add to your bios, as the dean mentioned.
I think one thing I would clarify is that I'm elected rather than appointed.
Good
And
to
it's
know.
a kind of an interesting distinction that I think we're going to get into later.
Good, thank you. So I'm going to start with a couple of general questions, and then I'm going to ask questions from you, because I'm just going to warm you up a little bit, because that's really the point, is for you to get questions to answered about your issues in public service or your interests in it. So I'm going to start with something very simple. What prompted you to go into public service, or series of prompts, I would suggest? So start with Joni.
Start with me. Good afternoon, thank you. You know, for me, public service started really when I was very young, and that my father was a very strong community activist in the city of Bremerton. And so from about the time I was 4 or 5 years old, we were involved in something, whether it was Special Olympics, or which he was very active in. But I grew up in a household where community service in particular was a theme. And then after I graduated from WSU, I was actually a transfer student. I went to community college the first 2 years and then came here my junior year. I desperately needed work. I'm sure you'll all relate to that at some point. And my first job I got was actually in bank management, and I hated it. And so I applied for a position at the city of Bremerton for an accountant, which was what my degree was in accounting and finance. And started at the city of Bremerton and very quickly learned how much I liked being around public, kind of the issues around public service. Even though it was an accounting and a technical job, I got into leadership fairly quickly there after about a year and was able to be very close to the political debate and discourse and conversation. And I just found a real thirst for it, probably out of a bit of my roots. And so that's really how it started. And from then I went into 2 city jobs, 2 county jobs, and now with the regional transit authority called Sound Transit, and have never regretted my decision to be in the public sector and public service.
Well, my reasons weren't so altruistic. I went into it for the money. I wanted to be a lawyer when I grew up, and I was putting myself through school at WSU, and it wasn't until I was about halfway through that I realized I wanted probably to be a lawyer. I was also taking a lot of sociology classes, and the practical side of me said, maybe if I get a job as a cop for a couple of years, I could save money for law school. So I did not have altruistic motives when I got into it, but once I got in that patrol car and I was actually doing social services at the most grassroots level, that's when I realized I really enjoyed doing something that made a difference. And I think that's what most of us look for, is you want to have a job that you feel like you're having some influence and that what you're doing matters. And the great thing about police work was several times a day I would have contact with people who were in desperate need of some type of help. And I always felt better at the end of the day, like, you know, what I did today was worthwhile and it mattered. So 31 years later, I'm still thinking about going to law school. But once I got in that patrol car and, started driving fast with the lights and siren on, it was just, law school just didn't sound so good after that. So I just stuck with it.
Well, I think I started out, I was a child of the Kennedy era when government was a good place to be where you could make a difference. I still believe that is an honorable, good work. So I grew up with that. But I was looking to go back. I'd worked for the YWCA and a nonprofit. And I was looking to go back to graduate school, and the 2 options were an MBA or an MPA. And I remember I picked up a Harvard Business Review, and I truly don't know how I got my hands on it. And basically, the data showed that women were being promoted in government, and they weren't being promoted in the private sector. There was always the good article in the newspaper, but the data was there, and I decided that I really wanted to be in charge. I've always much liked to be in charge, much more than taking orders. So I decided that if I was going to go up in the ranks, that I really would go into government. Interestingly, yesterday I decided to do a little data search and see how things have changed. And not so much. What I found was in the private sector, in the Fortune 500 companies, only 2% of them are headed by women, and only 13% of their boards are headed by women. So things haven't changed in these 30-some years since I made that decision. And I think, like Sue, the other reason was I worked for a nonprofit, and when I went to work for government, I doubled my salary. So it was also better pay than the world of the nonprofits. But it was basically a place where women were recognized, women were promoted, and I thought it would be a better career path for me.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one more before I go to the audience. And I'm going to start with you, Patricia, this time. I've held elected office, and Sue, you were elected to your office. And Joni and Patricia, you are both appointed to yours. Do you think there's a difference in the challenges women face running for public office as opposed to occupying an appointed position? Even besides the running for election, which I'm here to agree with you is gruesome. So other differences.
Other than differences, absolutely. I always used to say that the way that I could keep my job was to make sure that my boss got elected. And so in the city, we had a rule that all good news came from the mayor and all bad news came from department directors. So my job was to make my boss look good, stay in the background as much as I could, try not to be on the front page of the paper, and make sure that my boss got the credit so that he could be elected. I never needed to be elected. So I think it's very different when you're an elected official. You have to have your name out there. You have to run for office. If you're in an appointed position, you don't have to do that. So you behave a little, at least we behaved in the city, in how we put ourselves out versus having our boss out. And I think the other thing I learned early on was that elected officials don't like department directors that are more popular than they are. They also don't like department directors that they can't fire because they have such a strong constituency. And I watched some of my peers take all the credit for what they did and become very popular. That didn't make them popular inside with an elected official. So that's the other difference, I think, is to be very careful that your boss is the most popular person in the city, not you.
That's a good distinction. Well, I kind of describe it as being an elected official. You're like the piñata at the party. Everybody can take a swing at you from whatever angle, but you're the thing that draws everybody to the party sometimes as well. And so, like anything, there's pluses and minuses. When I first got into the job of the elected sheriff, I was not very excited about the idea of mixing politics with law enforcement. I thought that was a really bad thing. I thought it would be, political influence is bad. But what I learned is just the opposite, is when you're an elected law enforcement leader, you're responsible directly to the people. So rather than worrying about making my boss look good, I have to worry about providing service to the community and being accountable directly to the community. I don't have an elected official to hide behind. If I screw up, I'm accountable for it. It's a lot of work, and when you get into politics, as you know, you become completely exposed, and you have to make sure that when you speak the truth, because if you lie or you misinterpret or you try to mislead, it's always going to come back and get you. The thing I like about being an elected official, like Patricia, I like being in charge. And because I don't have a boss per se other than the 2 million voters in King County, I am responsible. I can make things happen, I can influence things, and I get to decide how I'm going to run my organization. So that part of it is very valuable, but it is a lot of work and you are very vulnerable, and that's a big step to take.
Well, I would agree with both of their comments. I'm in a slightly different role. I do work for an 18-member board, 17 of which are local elected officials that are appointed to my board, so they're not directly elected. So I'm in the role as Chief Executive Officer, which is really more of a private sector model. I totally agree with Patricia that when you're in the appointed positions, it's very important to not take the stage away from the elected officials, and I've worked for probably 28 years of my career for elected officials in the various positions I've been in. I think it takes, frankly, a lot more courage to go out and be an elected official, to put yourself out there on the line. My experience working for elected officials and with elected officials is that the lion's share are very honorable. They work hard, they're honest, and they're just trying to deliver the type of service that Sue is talking about. And I frankly have been out in front a lot, especially with my current job at Sound Transit, because we've had so much controversy, for those of you that have followed any of it, in the Puget Sound. But it's a very different role. You are taken as an appointed public official. You actually, believe it or not, I think you come in the door with actually in some ways a little bit more credibility with the public, because you earned your position versus ran for it and won a popularity contest. And I think that's a distinction that's not accurate, but I think it's a perception distinction about appointed versus elected.
Interesting. I'll make one comment about when I was an elected official in the 80s, it was before email. People who didn't like you had to look you in the eye and say, "You stink," or something. Now, the power of email and all of the other networking devices, they get to just do it quietly, and then they can send it off to other people. So you get abused pretty much on a daily basis from someone sitting in their own kitchen or den or wherever, out in the street in their car, send you abusive messages. Now, Joni, do you get that as much as a appointed official as undoubtedly Sue and I always did?
Well, I definitely get my share of abusive email. Often when a train breaks down or we get it, from the customer service side is where we'll get it. But I do think that is, I'm looking around this room and we're significantly older than most of you in the room, so you probably can't even imagine that you didn't have this kind of access to email that you have now, or the social media. But I think it's actually for both. I think if you're the head if you're the point person, you get the brunt of it. But I think elected officials get it more. They're fairer game, I think.
Mm-hmm. So just any of you who are thinking of going into elective office should need to have thick skin. It's just all there is to it. It's just too easy to shoot at you. Okay, have we stimulated any questions from the audience? Anybody have a question about anything we've talked about? There's no dumb question. Okay, we'll keep going a little bit and think about it. Yeah, well, that's true. We might get to
Our
that.
president has a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
All four of you have amazing careers. What advice would you then provide to our students here in the audience about how to shape and form their career paths?
Well, I guess I'll start this time. I would say, especially when you're at the age where you're in college, is always keep your options open. I know that I changed my mind several times while I was in college about what I wanted to do, and so I think until you discover what you're passionate about, keep your options open. And then once you find something that really grabs you, where you feel like, I want to learn more about whatever this topic is, or I think I can do something here, I think I can change something or influence something, I think that drive, that's where, for me, that's where you recognize this is what I want to do. And then pursue it 100%, and be willing to take risks. That's huge. Don't always take the safe road. Think about, if you have an idea about something and you think you can do it better or make it better, just do it. And what I discovered is after you get really good at failing after a while, and then pretty soon you're not so afraid of failing and you're willing to try more things, and pretty soon you really are making a difference.
I'll go. I got into this starting with accounting as my technical program, but I actually started in nursing and learned pretty quickly that that was not something that was going to work for me, because they had me do a volunteer program at a nursing home, and it was painful every day. But I found it fed a little bit my soul, the passion about the public service side, but that was too close to the emotions for me, so I went the opposite into accounting. Went to just, books and ledgers, and then combined over time realized as I went through these various paths, like Sue said, that I had to find a passion. And for me, once I got into a public sector organization, while I went in as an accountant, I was able, by working exceptionally hard, I was young, female. I was the youngest person with 17 people reporting to me when I was 22 years old, because I passed a civil service exam. They don't do that as much anymore, but they did at the time. And what I found was my ability to work with people and to coach and counsel helped me kind of chase a lot of different options. And I've always been fortunate, because I think of my work ethic is strong and my values are strong, that I've always been able to kind of go into jobs that felt pretty risky, that were seemed like a bigger challenge than what I thought I could undertake, but somewhere, because of knowing I could make a difference if I just worked hard. So that's a long way of saying, I think if you can get into an organization or into a field that has the passion and has the opportunity for you to search around a little bit to what's the one really big thing, that it can open up way more doors than it might feel like. And I often tell people, especially in the public sector, if you find a technical skill, you can take it a lot of different places. If the technical skill often gets you in the door, and then it's really up to you to make more of it with your interests and your passions, and taking risk is really important. Being comfortable with risk.
And the hard work.
Yeah,
The hard work is right up there with risk.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I always tell people, under promise and over deliver. It's what I tell young people. But I think the thing about, I wish I could tell you that I planned my career out. I didn't. Just one thing opened up and something happened, and I worked hard and just went from place to place. So it wasn't really some thoughtful, planned event. But I think what I liked best about the public sector for me was the diversity there, that I could move around in it. I mean, when you look at us and the different places we've worked, I've worked at the health department. I was deputy superintendent of parks. I know nothing about parks. But I ran the Human Services Department. I spent a year at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The public sector is such a broad sector that I found it intellectually exciting. I could make lots of different choices and still stay within the public sector. I always said what I loved about it was I love the nexus of policy and politics. And a lot of people say, I'm a policy wonk, but I hate the politics. Well, if you're in government, you're also in politics. And if you can learn to embrace both of these, you can really make a difference and influence things at a local level is really fun.
Great, thank you. Did the fact that you're a woman affect your ability to move up the career ladder? And if so, how? Start with Joni.
You know, I don't, I actually think for me, my age was a bigger challenge. But if you took, because of where I was in my career when I first started, I think if you took age and being a female, at the time, the combination made it harder initially, but I really have never felt held back career-wise. I felt that the doors were there if I was willing to work, to do the work. I do think, and I still think this today, I think I had to work twice as hard as the guys that were in the jobs next to me to prove myself, because I didn't just have the standing as I started a position, and there's lots of examples. I will say that even today, what surprises me in 2010, so I graduated 25 years ago from WSU, I'm still shocked at how many rooms I'm in, or I'm the only woman in the room in leadership positions. I'm still, in this day and age, I'm still very surprised by that. There's a lot of great women, and you're seeing some of Sue and I work together actually quite a bit. She's my Sound Transit, we contract with the sheriff for our police force, so she's our police force. And there's a lot of great women in leadership positions, but not enough.
During my era, I was the token woman in the
Yeah.
room, but now you're the leaders in the room,
Yeah.
which
That's-
is a little
that's a
bit
different-
different.
yeah,
But
that's
that's
true.
been an evolution.
All right.
Well, I'll tell you a little story just to really illustrate how far we've come in 31 years. When I joined the sheriff's office, I showed up at my first precinct assignment. I was 22 years old, had just graduated from WSU, and I walked in the front door, all, bubbly and excited, and I said, hi, and I walk up to the desk, and the receptionist looked at me like, who the hell are you? And I said, where's the women's locker room? And she just about fell out of her chair laughing. And she said, oh, you're her. And then she yelled over her shoulder, did they clean out the janitor's closet yet? And so the women's locker room when I joined was the janitor's closet in the men's locker room. And so I walked through the men's locker room to get to my locker room. But I'm from a very large family. I have 6 brothers. I was the only girl. And so it was a dynamic that I was used to. Walking through the men's locker room was like lining up for bath time at home. It's like, hey, if you're shy, turn around. I don't really care. And so I think you have to come into it. For me, I came into it with the attitude. Remember, I got into it for the money. And I really needed the paycheck. So I wasn't really sensitive about what other women may have considered slights. I just thought it was kind of humorous. And I think, like Joni, I found being younger much more difficult than being female. When I was first promoted to be a patrol supervisor, I was 28 years old, and everybody on my squad that worked for me were men, and they were all at least 10 years older than me. And it was the age. I felt it was hard for me to keep my confidence up there, because I sat in front of the roll call, and I looked around and I thought, oh, for God's sakes, these guys have more experience in law enforcement than I do. What am I doing trying to supervise them? And so I had to just get my mind in the right place, and I told him, look, I'm not here to tell you how to do your job. I'm here to take the heat if something goes wrong. I'm here to support you and help you however I can. But for me, it's always been, the age has always been more difficult. And I'm with Joni, too. I always figure when I go to an event and there's no line at the women's restroom, we still have a ways to go. It was a real shocker for me when I joined the executive board of the National Sheriff's Association. Now, the National Sheriff's Association, if you look up Good Old Boys Network in the dictionary, that's one of the first examples they have. Because you might be surprised to know that not everybody in the country is as enlightened as we are. And when I joined the NSA, it was a little bit of an anomaly because, number one, out of 3,000 sheriffs in the country, only 30 of them are female, and 25 of those just run a small jail. But there's 3 elected female sheriffs on the West Coast. And so, we're getting in there, 3 out of 3,000. But when I joined the NSA, they said, it would make us look good if we had a female on our board. Now, to be on the board of the NSA, you literally have to run a full campaign, and you have to be elected by your fellow sheriffs. And so I was, taken aside right away and told, not in these exact words, but basically, you're going to be our token girl. And there was an African-American guy on the board as well, BJ, he's now the president. And so BJ and I kind of hung out together, say, hey, we're both the token members of the board, but you know what? We're going to have some influence here. We get in the door, and then that's the starting point. That's not the ending point. You get in the door and do that. And it's been very interesting because on this board, there are people, guys that have been sheriffs their family were sheriffs for generations. And it's really a lot of fun to exert a little bit of influence and shake them up a little bit when they have conversations. There are many sheriffs in the country that are very progressive. Lee Baca, the LA County Sheriff, is one of the most progressive police leaders in the country. But I also met the real Boss Hogg. If any of you watch, you're all probably born after the Dukes of Hazzard came on. But that's the contrast of the sheriffs, everything from Boss Hogg to Lee Baca. So it's been an adventure.
Well, I will start out by saying it was first an advantage. It's what opened the door. When I applied for a job as an administrator in the health department, I was just out of graduate school. I had one suit and a briefcase. And I had never taken a public health course in my life. But they needed a woman. There was no women in administration in the public health department in Seattle and King County. And so they needed one. They didn't want more than one, I can assure you. And I was that one. So that's the reason I got the job. I got it because I was a female. And it was interesting when I got there. They told me things like that women had different brains than men. These were public health people. It was quite an education. Maybe they do.
It might not have been a bad thing.
They may not have, and not only was I dealing with the fact that like you, I was young. I was 30. I looked about 22. And I looked very young in those days. And both my age and the fact, when you work in the public health department, there are 2 hierarchies, both the one that's on paper, and then there's a medical hierarchy. And I lacked 2 things. I wasn't a boy, and I wasn't a doctor. And those were the 2 criteria. And I know I used to go meet with the state health officers from around the state, and they were all men in those days. And I used to take a doctor with me because I wouldn't have the credibility. So I say, you just have to sit there, next to me in a white coat, and I'll say, isn't that right, Dr. Wood? And he'd say, yes, that's right.
Arm candy.
And so I used to take him to these meetings with me so that I could have a voice at the table, because otherwise I didn't have a voice at the table. I actually once had a physician that I had hired and did his evaluation every year, still a very good friend. He had to draw on an org chart because we were evaluating jobs and pay, and he left me out of the org chart. And had his line go straight to the doctor who ran the department, which I thought was interesting. And I called him in and said, Bob, didn't I hire you? Don't I do your evaluations every year? Why would you leave me out of the org chart? But certainly it was difficult for me, I think, for both of those reasons, both being young and working in an environment that had a medical hierarchy where I didn't have that. I forgot to go to medical school along the way. And I think I've heard a theme here that I think all of us would say is I was very successful in the health department, and I'm sure a lot of it was because I worked longer hours than everybody else. I worked every Sunday of my life. I never left the office till 7. I think all of us probably had the same experience. It's the comment that you probably don't know who Ann Richards was, who used to be, the governor of Texas, who talked about, we were as good as men. We did everything that Fred Astaire did. She just did it backwards in high heels, for to Ginger Rogers. So I think, if you think about it that way, I think we did everything the men did, but sometimes we were doing it backwards in high heels, and we were probably working longer hours to prove that we were more than 29 years old and that we could carry our own weight.
So I would note that I don't think any of us have the age problem anymore.
No, we've gone past that.
Finally got over that.
Gosh, yeah, we went right
I just
past it.
told them earlier that I had dyed my hair white so I would look more mature. You probably don't believe it either.
Yeah, well, there was something I was going to add, but I think I'm having a senior moment, trying to remember what it was. Oh, I know what it was. In terms of my advice about whatever the issue is for you, for us female, us young, something Sue said I wanted to reinforce. I didn't comment on it. But you got to roll with the punches a bit. And I think when you're new in organizations and when you're trying to meet your own challenges, we all grew up a bit in the era of women's lib when it was the big thing, long before many of you young women in the room. But I don't think any one of us would ever say we had a chip on our shoulder about that. I don't think Connie did. And I think your ability to work with anybody, fellow, peer women, bosses, younger people, men, minorities, people with disabilities, any of it, it's all about the people and how you yourself present yourself in those settings, and not to just grab onto what some might say the first affront, somebody looked at me wrong or somebody had an attitude. And I do a lot of coaching in my organization. I've got about 450 employees. All different ages. And when I see disputes start to happen in the workforce, it's often because it's how somebody communicated and how they chose to take that communication. And I just think that that's when you think about careers, and it's all about working with people. And I think as young women in our professions, I can't speak for you, but I think not letting that get to me and being able to walk by the guys to the locker room is all part of just making it work in the workplace.
When I ran in the 80s, guys would say, well, who's home with your kids? I don't think that happens. I used to say my husband where he should be, but I don't know what.
Oh, it still happens.
It's still, do you bake cookies? Do you know how?
Well,
But
I always had people ask me, what does your husband think of you being a cop? Yeah, it's like, I worked with a lot of male cops. I never heard anybody ask them, what does your wife think of you being a cop? And I said, he likes the money. And the handcuffs are kind of cool to play with, too. Not that way.
That one will make it viral.
There's a YouTube clip.
what were some of the biggest challenges you faced in your career, either professionally or with your family? Start with Patricia this time.
Well, I think when I think of what the biggest challenges for women when I started out, and I still think in many respects women today, but more so in my era, was we didn't have any mentors. And if you look at the literature, it shows people do better who have mentors. I didn't have any mentors. There weren't any women in my ranks. And what we used to call the power of the mirror. There was no woman to look at and say, I want to be just like her. So I think for many of us, we really missed that in the early days. And I think the other thing that were some of the biggest challenges is my own self-doubts. There's something, if you read the literature, that a lot of my friends talk about called the imposter syndrome, where many of us who have made it, we get great pay, we get awards, but we still are just sure that we're imposters and someone's going to out us as not really being qualified for our jobs. And I actually pulled up some stuff yesterday about the woman who was the head of the World Health Organization when the last flu epidemic came out, and she talked about how she doesn't take credit for what she does at all because she's just sure she's going to be outed as really not knowing what she's doing. A woman of that of those credentials. So I think a lot of it was my own self-confidence, getting through that imposter syndrome that yes, I am qualified, yes, can do this job, and yes, I will do this job.
I think
Every woman I know that's a CEO or in a leadership position suffers from that. I always tell people, I'm just making it up as I go along, and eventually somebody's going to figure out I don't know what I'm doing. I think that's really common. I think it's probably more common in women than men, just because of the way we were socialized. I think for me, I'm going to talk about the challenges of balancing work and family. For me personally, that's been the toughest thing to do. I was raised, I've got two sons in their 20s, and I tell them I'm part of that schizophrenic generation where I was raised on Leave It to Beaver. You know, when I was a little kid, I wanted to be just like June Cleaver and be the perfect mom. But when I was in high school and college, that was the peak of the feminist movement. So I can't decide whether to follow, you know, Barbara Billingsley or Gloria Steinem. And so you have these ideas in your head about, you know, what a good mother is, but then you're trying to be a successful, you know, woman in the professional arena, and there's real conflict there. And I think during the women's movement, we were preached that you can have it all. Well, you can't have it all. You can't have more than 100%. And so at different times during my lifetime, the balance has shifted. Ideally, we would all like to believe that it's always 50-50, but that's not the case. And I think at least for women who are raising a family or taking care of elderly parents or have those other things outside their life, it's very difficult to put in the 80-hour weeks that sometimes you have to do to be successful as a leader. So I think for me, that's been the most difficult challenge, and I still struggle with it as I'm looking down the road toward retirement and what I want to do next. My husband has very different ideas, what he thinks about retirement compared to what I think retirement would be. So I think our generation in our 50s, we're a very conflicted group of women because our mothers raised us to be one way and the feminists told us you need to be this way. The good side is we have choices, and our mothers didn't have as many choices, but the choices are not easy choices, and they come with sacrifices on both sides.
Boy, I would say ditto to what both Patricia and Sue said. For me, I wasn't able to have children, so I didn't have the early family conflict that, unfortunately, that Sue's describing. But I went the path of, actually, I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a senior at WSU, I ran out of money. And so I had to go on food stamps in order to stay in school. And I was the first in my family to graduate from college at all. And I can remember one of these, in fact, I thought of it this morning when I was here. It was about 8 degrees below zero in February. And at that time, there was a lot of stories in the newspapers about food stamp fraud on college campuses. Yeah, welfare queens. So they did an allotment for college. I don't know how they do it now, but they did allotments, and it was kind of a first come, first served to your allotment if you qualified. And my family had never been on welfare. And everybody was we were all horrified about it. So there I was on the pavement, sitting on the pavement about 6 a.m, waiting for the office to open at 8 to be able to get my food stamps. And I remember to this day sitting there saying, I will absolutely never be reliant on somebody else for my income. Never, never, never. And that, for me, put me on a bit of an overachiever course that I'm not quite off of yet. But it also meant that I made some, not very smart choices early on the marital front. So in all, candor and honesty, I have 2 divorces under my belt, but I've just had my 20-year wedding anniversary, so I finally got it right. But when I look back on that, I was in the conflict that you're talking about here. I went with dating people that were in kind of one image and marrying them, but my career path and my desire to be self-dependent and not dependent on somebody else for my income and for my future drove me to be a very high overachiever career-wise, and that was a conflict in both of my first 2 marriages. Still great friends, but I think knowing and understanding a little bit about what those conflicts are, and I look at, we're talking a lot about the women here, and I'm looking at many young men in this room, and I consider you the enlightened ones, that you're here listening to us talk about what some of those trade-offs and challenges are, because I actually think those are there for men and women as you're starting careers and marriages and families and balancing. My stepson, who's a graduate from WSU, has 3 kids, and he's a CPA, and he's a stay-at-home dad now. He made that choice. And his wife made the choice as a CPA also to be the career person because they thought it was best for the family. So it was a very interesting choice for them about raising a family and having that balance. So
I always say about Joni when I introduce her, she's one of the more honest people I've ever met. So now and women tend to share information, so now you've had both of those attributes. So, any questions yet? We stimulated anybody have a question? Just anything. Yes.
I just kind of had a general question. I've always been curious.
You want to stand up?
I've always been curious about what the job responsibilities are of like a county sheriff. I've never really known what that is.
Okay. He asked what the job responsibilities are for the county sheriff.
I get to do whatever I want. I mean, to be real honest with you, legally, it's pretty broad. But as a practical matter, I function like a police chief would function. I run the organization. We have about 1,100 employees. And I have the ultimate responsibility for public safety in the county. Inside the cities, police chiefs manage their cities, but I have dual jurisdiction within those cities. And so while I focus on unincorporated King County, where I have primary jurisdiction, about 340,000 citizens, we have contracts with 12 cities and both transit agencies. So there's a lot of different arenas that I have to stay on top of. But it's a CEO, basically, of a police department is what the sheriff does. There's some civil things that we do, but those are, really boring. You wouldn't want to know.
I'll tell you this, in the old days, at another county whose name I won't mention, the sheriff used to do other things like pave your driveway in order to get votes, things like that. You look at this upright female here, and it didn't always used to be that way. It was a territory of corruption. Mm-hmm. All the boss hog sort of stuff.
Exactly.
And it wasn't that long ago when that changed. Another question. Anybody? Yes, back there.
As women, and especially women kind of in the first in your role, do you think you approach your positions differently than your male counterparts? And if so, how is that?
I'm going to repeat the question simply for the video. Since you are women, often the first in your roles, do you approach your job in any different way than you think a male might? Is that kind of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
How does that translate?
How's that translate?
Patricia?
Well, I would tell you that I can speak for myself and they can speak but I will tell you that if I looked at men department directors that I worked with, I would guess that I put in a lot more hours than they did. So I think I was always probably afraid of failure and always working hard to prove myself. I think that probably my relationships with my senior staff would probably have been closer personal relationships than men might have had. The people in my last job and most of the jobs I worked with who were my team were people that I cared for tremendously personally, and we had a personal relationship. Most of us did with each other, so I would probably guess I also approached it with a more personal basis than a man might have approached the job.
I found for myself, I had to always be aware of that line between being strong and powerful and bitch. Let's be honest, Hillary Clinton she didn't manage that line very well, I don't think. But it really is a fine line, and I don't care if it's 20 years ago or 20 years from now. Men and women are different, and they are perceived differently, and so you have to use your power appropriately, and people have different filters about how you're using your power based if you're male or female. So I'm with Patricia. I think most of the women I know in leadership positions, we put in a lot of hours because the fear of failure is so much greater. And I know when I joined the sheriff's office, it was during the time that affirmative action was in full swing. And there were a lot of people that really hated affirmative action and assumed that most women or people of color that were in positions had it given to them because of affirmative action. And so we had to work, I think, a lot just to prove that, no, this wasn't given to us. We actually really did earn this. But I always felt like I had to really walk a tightrope there. Strong, but there was a line. And I still struggle with that sometimes.
I definitely struggle with that. Sue's point. Every job I've had, I've followed a man in the job, and I think if you talked with my employees in the differences in the three jobs, the most recent jobs that I can think about, they would say that I was definitely a harder worker, but that I was more open and more sensitive to understanding, when you have large organizations, you can't know every employee for sure. But I do think that the intuition that I think there is something to female intuition. I really honestly do believe that over time. And I think the fact that that I could communicate, I think any employee in my organization would say they would be absolutely comfortable walking in my door and having a conversation with me and not feel threatened by me. I mean, I definitely respect chain of command and all of that. That's important. And I'll ask them if they have a complaint. Did you go through your supervisor? But I've always felt it was important to be both real and perceived as being there for the employees, because you don't get any of these jobs done except through your people. And if your people don't respect you or they don't like you, they might do their jobs, but they're not going to do it in the best way possible for themselves and the agency. So I see myself as someone much more than at least the people I've replaced that channel the energy of the organization by caring a lot about the people.
I suspect, too, that I have 3 adult sons, Sue, you must, and Joni and Patricia as well, probably. But I think that we are raising different young people, as you are, than we had to work with 20, 30 years ago. I'm pretty positive that is true, but I suspect there are also exceptions. But it's just a different world now. Even being parents and dads and all of that's a different world than it was.
I just had this conversation with my oldest son. We were hiking in the North Cascades yesterday, and I told him, I said, I'm so proud of you being part of Gen Y, the 20-somethings. Because I said, your generation to me is going to be the next greatest generation, because I think their generation has the advantage of seeing things from a different point of view. But your generation has also been through great hardship, and we often forget about that. 9/11, Enron, the financial collapse, these are really, really difficult times. But I think a lot of kids in their 20s were raised at a time when parents, I think we learned a lot more about how to raise kids, and I think particularly the boys were growing up, they saw their mothers and women doing things much differently than my husband's generation, and so they're much more open-minded. I know my son was telling me, we talked about, he's thinking about getting married, and talked about, I said, do you want Lori to be able to stay home with the family or work? And he goes, he goes, it doesn't really matter to me. It'd be great if she could stay home, but if she wants to work, that won't be an issue either. We'll manage it. Whereas a generation before, we wouldn't have had that kind of conversation.
Yeah. This woman you may know is your vice president at WSU for IT. So when you eventually get all your email things straightened out and all the programs straightened out, this will be who you thank for that. We thank her.
I have a non-technical question. You're all 3 women, you're highly successful, and you all had to blaze a trail. And you've left a trail for others hopefully to follow. So my question is, first, do you believe that you have to support other women and help them along? And second, do you have plans in your own organizations or even among your friends to help other women be successful?
Well, I think I always felt an obligation to younger women because I didn't have that mirror. I didn't have that mentor. And my door was open to just about any young woman who was a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend who would call my office. I would make time for them. And there was also a group of women department directors in the city of Seattle, and we had sort of an unwritten rule between us that we would always open the door to each other. And so, yes, I did a lot of that. In fact, as a retiree, I'm still doing a lot of that, meeting with young women, talking about where their next career move is, whether this is a good move or a bad move. when I was with the city, we actually had a program for young men and women to move up into department director roles. We would nominate about 13 a year, and we each took one of them on every year for the entire year as a mentor. So I think it's terribly important, and I got a great deal of, it was one of the better things I did during my day. I thoroughly enjoyed being a mentor to young women, and I think that most of us in our positions really enjoyed that part of our job because we really lacked it. And I heard someone say the other day that for some women my age, there were men mentors. I didn't happen to have one, but they were talking today about the fear of sexual harassment and all the kinds of issues that men today are actually less likely to mentor women than they used to be because they're sort of afraid of any kind of special relationship. So I think it's even more incumbent on those of us who've made it to mentor and promote those young women.
I agree. I know amongst my peers, female peers, there is a sense of camaraderie that we want to support and help each other. I will say I have been lucky to have many mentors in my career. They've all been men just because of the field that I'm in. But when I became sheriff, it really broadened the people that I was exposed to. And yet I still find that most of my mentors are men. There's kind of a dirty little secret, though, about successful women, and that is I encountered much more resistance when I ran for political office from women than I did with men. Women generally, as a group, don't trust other women. And so I think we have to be very honest about that. When I was campaigning, I got many more sharp, difficult questions from women than I did from men. So I think that's just something in our culture that we have to be thinking about. Again, in my group of friends and professional friends, we are very supportive. But when you get a little more broad, it's not as friendly as you might think. And while I think it's important to have female mentors, I think it's important not to just have female mentors, because the male mentors that I've had have really helped me see the world a little differently. And there's really no blinders or limits on the way they see the world. And so I tended to kind of adopt the way that they looked at the world.
Yeah, I would agree. I was just thinking back. I've had no formal mentors when they talk about formal mentoring, but I've had many informal, and I'm just scanning it. They've all been men. So throughout my career, I've had the pleasure of having some male somewhere that was in a influence position that was the one that pushed me to stretch myself to the next job or the next promotion, that saw something in me I didn't see in myself, that I didn't have that confidence factor to really go there without somebody pushing and opening some doors for me. So from that standpoint, I didn't have the female mentors, but they weren't there, but I had the male mentors. And I just support mentoring, period. I am always amazed because I don't think about myself any longer as a female first. I mean, it's just not in my thinking that much. And so when young women do come to me, even some of our younger female employees, and they want to talk, I forget that there is a bit of a duty and responsibility as a woman in leadership to do that more, because I don't think about it being special to be the type of woman leader or to be recognized as I am. It's who I am. It's where I am. I don't think about it. I don't put labels on it at all. And so I'm always touched when an employee or somebody will come up to me and say, do you know, or I'll get emails, do you know how much it means to me that you are where you are and the hope it gives me? And I have to pause and go, gosh, no, I honestly didn't think about it, and I thank you for that reminder, because I do think that we all need support and we all need mentors, and so I try to do it more, and those little emails I get on occasion, the reminders kind of pump me back up to go out and do it.
Thanks, Viji. Another question? Yes.
Joni, you mentioned going to community college for 2 years and then coming here and then getting food stamps to continue. So you mentioned being one of 7 children. I don't imagine your parents had a lot of money, but I don't know. That's what
I worked 3 jobs while I was going to college.
Okay, in today's daily Evergreen, there was stories that fewer kids are going to be getting financial aid to attend Washington State. Could you explain the role of public education in your lives?
It's huge.
Did you get that
huge.
question? Can you explain the role of public education in your life, particularly regarding how you got yourself through college?
Yeah, I put myself through college also. I actually started in high school. My first job ever was a janitor in my dad's real estate office. And then in those days, you learned how to type before you learned how to do almost anything else for women. We all took stenography and typing, and I was a very fast typist. So all through my community college 2 years and my 2 years, except my last semester at WSU, I was a part-time receptionist or secretary. I worked every vacation at home. I worked every summer to have money. My family had a small business. It wasn't a very profitable one, but it was so profitable by the standards that I couldn't qualify for financial aid through the college, either of the 2 colleges. So I was doing the 2 and 3 jobs. Over here, my junior year, I typed term papers for people, $1 a page. It's quite a deal. I learned a lot that way about all sorts of other topics. But I simply wouldn't be where I am without having had these educational opportunities. I had a 7-year split between when I got my master's at University of Puget Sound, and I did that at night school. It sounded like others did it. I was working full-time and went to night school for my MBA, commuted to Seattle from Bremerton in addition to do the night program at UPS. So my husband, actually, interestingly enough, is in the community college business. So he's very focused on community colleges, and I'm a product of it, and I'm a product of this fabulous university, and it just wouldn't be there. I think public education is this, you hear it said, the great equalizer, and I absolutely believe that. And I think that we have a very serious problems in funding for public education around the country, but in our state in particular. And we, the citizens of our state, and you, the students and employees, we've got to really band together to do something about it, because the type of, I'll get off my bandwagon here, my soapbox, but I have a niece who's a PhD student at University of Iowa. She's got student loans right now of up to $88,000. I don't know, I just can't even imagine having that kind of a debt as a student coming out of a college. And I mean, there's many of you that are probably having to look at student loans. And as you try to advance your career, whether it's medical or being a lawyer or whatever, and you go into those additional colleges, the stress on the student for learning with the financial responsibilities, I think is pretty intense, way more intense than it was for me at the time.
Well, I agree with Joni. I have a more direct connection. My husband is a high school teacher, and he is the proverbial shop teacher. He started out teaching drafting and physics, and woodshop teacher retired, and he went to fill in, and he enjoyed it. And it's interesting because he and I get into some real interesting discussions about vocational education and his frustration that public schools tend to only focus on college prep rather than a more broad, adult learning beyond high school, whatever that might be. So I think public education is absolutely critical, and I think it has to be broad, because in my police profession, I see the results of people who were not successful in public education, and they end up, because they don't feel successful, they go find another way to make money, and that usually doesn't turn out very well. The other thing we've all talked about, working to put ourselves through college, I missed a lot of college because of that. There was a lot of programs that I didn't participate and get involved in because when I wasn't in class, I was working trying to make money. When my oldest son went to college, I made sure that we had saved up and we paid for his basic education with the caveat that he worked during the summer. But he was able to get involved in extracurricular activities that really, those were almost as valuable as the education itself. So while I think it's valuable to develop a strong work ethic by putting yourself through school, there is a price to pay for it. You do miss out on a lot of the college experience. So, but I agree, it is the most critical thing for a culture. If we're not educated, we're really in deep trouble.
Well, like the other two, I'm the youngest of 5 children, and my parents had 8th grade educations. But interestingly, when I think about my parents were able to send us to school, my dad drove a second job he drove a school bus as a second job. But when I went, I worked every summer, and it tells you how old I am. I'm 64. Next couple weeks, it was $1,500 a year. I lived in a sorority. I earned $500 in the summer, and my parents gave me $100 a month. And I graduated with no debt. When I think about young people today trying to go to college and their parents who, if I were to be alive today and trying to go, my parents couldn't afford it. And that bothers me, that my parents with 8th grade educations could send their kids to college, at a university. I remember one morning early, I had a 7:45 class. It was awful. I remember walking across campus and just being thrilled that I was here. Absolutely thrilled that I was at a university. There were only 2 in the state at the time, and my brother was at the UW, so I wasn't going to go there. But my parents could afford that, and I could work, and we could do it. And I think it's tragic that our elected officials have reneged on, I think, that public obligation to make a 4-year degree, however you get that, affordable to families. I have friends who, are lawyers and doctors, and they're saying, we can't afford to send our kids to college. And I just look at them going, oh, come on, sure you can. But it's the proportion of a parent's income now to send a child to college versus the proportion of my parents' income to send a child to college. That has changed dramatically, and I think it's a tragedy.
It's true. I think when I was here, which was when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I think tuition was something like $500 a semester, and I was my sorority house manager and was a lab instructor, which was then the best job on campus, $1.50 an hour. You had half of your house and everybody else, that you were their boss, which was kind of worth it. In any event, some of you touched on a little bit of what I'm going to ask you next. If you had your college days to do over, knowing what you know in your career, would you do anything different? Sue, you've indicated that it would have been a good experience to do a little extracurricular.
Yeah, I think I was in such a hurry. I was of the mindset that as soon as you graduate from high school, you go straight to college. As soon as you graduate from college, you go into your lifelong career. And I missed a lot of opportunities along the way if I hadn't been in such a rush. But I was a little bit like Joni. Part of it was survival. I knew that I was going to be on my own, and I had to make money to survive. So there was a little bit of a rush. So if you have the opportunity to take a few side trips along the way, I think those are really valuable because there's a lot to be learned in those side trips. I would also say, whenever you can take classes outside of your regular major, do that, because it's always going to benefit you to have a broader perspective on things. I know when I was at WSU, I took some music classes, I took pharmacy, and those were some of the most fun classes I had, and it helped balance out that sort of singular focus to get from point A to point B.
Well, like the rest of you, I actually graduated in 3.5 years for all the reasons that everybody else did. It was an overachiever. I was economics, and I graduated on Friday and went to work on Monday. And I have been unemployed for 5 days of my entire career. So yes, all of those things. If I had it to do over again, and I inherited 2 young women when they were 16, they are now both 40 and young PhDs. So I didn't have kids when they were little, but I did get them through college. I was the one who paid for all that. If there's one thing I would do that I couldn't do, or I didn't know how to do, it would be to travel. And junior year abroad was not a big deal when I went to school. Maybe it was. It just wasn't among my peers. We weren't taking off. Is the education that went with traveling. If I could go back and somehow pair up some of the traveling with some of the education I did, now I've traveled a great deal, and what an education it is. I wish I'd done it younger. It would have given me a different perspective, I think, on the world. And if I could do anything over again, I would somehow I'd figure out how I funded some travel that went with my education.
I would actually. Those are both of the two things I would have said. I never really knew whether my. I don't believe I had a college experience. I mean, when I look back about it, going 2 years living at home, going 2 years to community college, and then transferring over here so that I didn't have to live at home, and I could get out of the house. Because if it was at University of Washington, I would have just commuted from Bremerton by ferry, and I still wouldn't have had a college experience. But because I was having to do all the jobs similar to Sue, I did almost no extracurricular activities. Plus, coming into the university as a junior, I was a little bit not, I mean, the people that already had a lot of their friendships formed from their freshman and sophomore years was a little bit different coming in there. And I definitely, when I look back over both high school and college, I wish I would have had a foreign exchange opportunity. I really missed having that. It wasn't even in my thinking in those days, and I look back now, and that was a real miss.
Questions? One over here. There we go. Yes.
Many marvelous themes have come out of your comments, but a couple that you've come back to several times were good work ethic and kind of implicitly perseverance, persevering through the difficult times. You know, as people now well established in your careers, it's easy to look back and say all that work was worthwhile and it paid dividends. But for younger people that are looking at all that work ahead of them, you know, what advice would you give them? You know, how do they convince themselves that the work is worth it? And maybe what were some of the things that helped you persevere through difficult times in your more formative years?
Okay. Everybody has a strong work ethic here. What would you suggest to others about persevering in that? Thumbnail?
Yeah, as you put yourself back in your younger years, looking forward, and you hit those tough times, you know, kind of what helped you keep persevering, keep working hard through those difficult times?
Well, I guess I was just going to say, absolutely fear of failure. You know, I look back and there is no one that could ever be harder on me than me. And that has been a driver for me the entire time. And you know, I've looked back both in my college years where I was just go, get the, you know, it was a path to my future. It wasn't an experience. So I hope you all take time to have the experience in this path. I really sincerely believe that as I look back on it. But even career-wise, I can look at every early job that I had, and there was some seemingly insurmountable hurdle at the time that seemed like it was just like, oh my gosh, how am I going to deal with this? Every single job, I can point to a number of those that seemed at the time like I didn't know how I was going to get through it. And for you all, in fact, my goddaughter is here, Sarah, and she's a second-year student, and we were talking about the fact that she's on an architecture path, and that's maybe a 6-year path here. And how do you stay focused? I try to think back about when I was a sophomore and thinking if I had 6 more years ahead of me, how would I stay centered on that? But I think the perseverance for me came from the importance of what it was I was trying to achieve for myself, for my family. I wanted my family's pride that they actually collectively helped get somebody through college for the first time, and then to be able to continue. And each time a challenge comes up, you do persevere because you keep your eye on the focus of what you're trying to achieve and the importance of it.
I think for me, I said a little earlier flippantly, you learn to fail. And I think for me, when I've been in a really tough situation and I thought, oh my God, how am I going to get through this? You have to learn to fail. Then you're not afraid of it. And then you're more willing to try different things. And so when I've been in the depths of something really bad going on, I've done it so many times that I realize eventually this is going to be over. Eventually it's going to stop hurting, and then there's going to be something good at the other side of it. But I think you have to toughen up a little bit. You have to go through that. And if you're the kind of person that's always been successful at everything you do, I think it's harder for people like that because you're so afraid of hitting a wall or having a failure. So I guess I would just say if you're going through a really bad time, know that it's going to eventually get over, and you're going to come out the other end a tougher, stronger person, and it won't be so bad the second time and the third time and the fourth time.
I think there's a couple things I would say. One is, in my early days in the health department, when, as I said, I really didn't have a public health background, there were some other women who had started about the same time I did at different places, and we were, and today we are still very good friends. Actually, 3 of us are having dinner on Saturday night. We provided tremendous support to each other. And I can still remember we would be the ones who were there late at night. And so I had a support group. There wasn't a mentor above me, but there were some women who came in at the same time as I did in different places in the department. And we basically supported each other. The other thing I think is, well, there were really hard times and you worked hard. I found myself in rooms where I could never have imagined that I would be. I found myself testifying before Congress. I found myself speaking to a room of 3,000, mostly doctors, thinking I was just going to choke. I was so frightened about the early days of AIDS. I found myself on a CDC, Center for Disease Control Advisory Committee on AIDS. And I would look around, and some of it was so exciting, I would never, ever have placed myself in those rooms. And there I was. And so there was part of my job that I had tremendous passion for, and it was exciting, and it was very heady to be in some of those rooms with some of those people who were asking me a question, and I was stunned that they would listen to the answer. But so part of the job was really exciting. Public health in the early days of AIDS was tremendously exciting. The smartest people I've ever met were involved. And so I've had some wonderful experiences, and I think those keep you going when you realize that people do want you at the table, and it's very exciting.
One other thing I thought of. Early in my career, I actually got some advice from a retired city manager when I was new as a city manager, and he told me 2 things. The first was, when you're facing a really difficult situation, try to think of the last time that you were going through what you thought was a job or life-threatening crisis, and do you even still hardly remember it, because it seemed like it was so intense at the time. The second piece was never let them see you sweat. And those were 2 great pieces of advice.
There's no crying in baseball.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm going to just add to this one, even though I'm your moderator. I had a little bit different compelling. My parents were both immigrants and got themselves through life in a very complicated way. And my dad used to take me out and say, you are responsible for you, and down the road, don't count on anybody else taking care of you. We're talking 50s now. And in the 50s, not when I was 50. And that was unusual then for a young woman. But he had been so frightened by his circumstances that he wanted me to know that don't ever count on anybody else but you, that you always need to be able to get a job. And frankly, microbiology was that job for me that I could do. I could do it today. And yet I went on to do other things. But to have the options for choices, but always in the back of my mind was, can I get a job tomorrow? And now I'm a lot older in retirement, but I still think about it. Still makes me nervous. Any other questions? Yes.
You're all very successful in your heading organizations, and so it looks like you have a lot of discretionary power. But you're also management that's rank and file, and typically organized in some sort of union, benevolence, and so on. So how do you deal with the rank and file? I'm thinking, what's the most complicated issue that you have to deal with when you deal with the rank and file? It gives you the most problems trying to resolve in a fair way.
Okay, so what's the most difficult situation you have in dealing with the rank and file of whatever your jobs may be, and you all have unions, et cetera, to deal with?
Well, I'll jump into this because we had a little conversation over lunch. Unions make it more complicated to deal with the rank and file. I think that there is a tendency in some union leadership to want to split the employee's loyalty away from the mission of the job and keep the loyalty focused on the mission of the union. And so I find that really challenging. Also, for a union to survive, they have to create an illusion that you, the rank and file person, need to be protected from the leader from the boss. And so it's very difficult when you've got this organized, sophisticated force trying to set up a dynamic like that. And I find that developing credibility with the rank and file is more challenging, but it can be done. But it takes a lot of time, and it takes in-person conversation and commitment. It's challenging for me because my folks are spread around about 25 different work sites, and so getting FaceTime with people is difficult. But I have to have credibility as a leader, or it's lost. And so I would say keeping people tracking toward the same mission, having loyalty directed the same way. At the end of the day, the loyalty is to serving the community, and sometimes that gets lost in the push and pull between who you're working for.
I have dealt with many unions, and so I can agree with that, although the statistic that I also use is that when you're dealing with poverty, and you look at all the programs you can do about getting people out of poverty, the most successful one is joining a union. If you want to do an anti-poverty program, that is still the most successful thing you can do, because people in unions usually have health care and wages. But I think the thing that's very difficult with the rank and file staff is because people who work for me are usually incredibly committed to what they do. They are people who have great passion for their job. It's not just putting widgets, it's public health, it's human services. And when you change leaders, as in mayors, and you have to come to them and say, this mayor's priority is going to be early learning or education, and we're not going to focus so much. It's very hard for staff. They feel that they have a constituency, and I used to say, you know, there's still a hierarchy, and the mayor still sets up here. Guess what? And but when priorities change, and you've asked staff to be passionate about one set of priorities, and then someone new is elected, and you have to go to them. And your credibility is on the line, being able to explain why that aging this year is not going to be our priority, and we're going to take money out of here, and we're going to put more money over in early learning. So I think explaining to staff who don't deal in a political environment, changes in a political environment, is always a very difficult transition.
For me, in every job, until I came to Sound Transit, I've always had a organized workforce. And interestingly enough, at Sound Transit, we've only got one union, and it's got 7 people, and it's our operators in Tacoma Link, where we run the small streetcar system down there. And so it's actually been an interesting dynamic, because I think in this day and age, with what's happening with the economic recession and the budget layoffs and the challenges, I just had to go through a process of cutting employee benefits. We've all been having to do that. But Sound Transit's in a unique position because we went to the ballot in 2008 and got an expansion plan approved and a new tax improved, that we're growing. We're one of the only organizations that's adding to staff, and everybody around us is laying off staff, furloughing staff, cutting benefits. So I had to go to my workforce because financially we just can't continue to afford the type of medical benefits that we've had, and not having a labor union to have that conversation with, and having to need to have the conversation with 455 employees was really a different way to try to figure out how to communicate with my workforce, because you can go battle with the union organizer, but it's one battle with one group of voices. But actually, I was very proud of my staff. When I went through the way I did it, you said, what's the difficult situation? How'd you handle it? I laid out, just put the facts out. I pulled them all into a mandatory meeting because we're only 450, so I can get them still with overflow in one of our big rooms. And I just went through the rationale and what was going on and why, and then I told them what my decision was on what the level of cut was. And I had probably 35 emails from employees thanking me for laying out the reason, laying out the numbers, and that they knew it was a hard decision, and they could tell I still had their back. That they could tell it was a hard decision for me to have to do that to them and me. I mean, I'm part of the plan too. But they appreciated that they had the communication, and I think there's an upside and a downside from that standpoint about the ability to communicate and work through a problem. I'd still take my current circumstance.
Me too. Me too. Okay. We have to wind up in about 3 minutes. Just one final question. If you haven't said it already, what would you say to a young person today, for instance, the people here in our audience who are going to enter public service? What little hint would you give, if you can?
I would say be idealistic. You know, that's the greatest thing about being young, is you tend to be idealistic, and don't let anybody talk you out of it. We need that idealism. That's how we progress and move forward. And take that idealism and try to find a thing that you think you can change or make better. And that's a great motivation to get through, you know, the struggles of getting through your education and everything else. Because my generation is depending on your generation to bail us out. So keep your idealism.
I would probably say, if you get a job in the public sector, find a mentor. Go find one, seek them out. I was always so impressed when usually some young woman would email me and say, would you have lunch with me? And I thought, boy, that's so gutsy to do that. And two, I was always pleased to do it. So I think put yourself out there and look around and think, who's the smartest, best person that you see, and approach them.
Well, I would hope that you are considering public service in the public sector. It is an amazingly rewarding, challenging, honorable profession. I think that there's a lot of language in the public sector about bureaucrats, and it's kind of the hotbed word and the stereotypical word about the public sector, and it's just so not true. It is so not true. I work with some of the smartest, most talented people I ever have in my career, from both public and private. And so I look ahead at what's going on in our country, and I worry that I don't see enough young people coming into the public sector. So I would just ask you all to really consider it as a profession. Somewhere in any one of your technical fields, any one of the technical fields can transfer into some level in the public sector. All of the jobs, no matter what area you're studying in, there's a job in the public sector for your career path. And I would really, really encourage you to do that, because we need your idealism, we need your talent, your brains, and your energy. The country needs you.
So, 2 sets of people to thank. I want to thank this wonderful panel for coming over and presenting here at Washington State. So we'll give them an applause. And I want to thank all of you for coming and being such a great audience. And best of luck with everything you choose to do.
Let me on behalf of the Foley Institute and the College of Liberal Arts, also thank you all for coming out tonight. Let me also just say one other thing. I mentioned at the outset, one of the core functions of the Foley Institute is to involve students in public service. And so hopefully you've had your appetites whetted for that. And if you have, you should come see us about internships, because we run lots of internship programs. And it's a good foot in the door, good way to experience public service while you're still at school. So again, on behalf, let me also say one other thing. We have a reception following this event. It's in 514, just next door here. You're all invited to that as well. And so on behalf of the Foley Institute, let me thank you all for coming out, and let me ask you to join me now in giving the panel a hand.